Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
In case you're wondering about those yard signs that are sprouting like spring flowers and those political pamphlets that are crowding your mailbox, there's a primary election coming up Tuesday in Indiana. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about the political process by which Republicans and Democrats nominate their candidates for the November general election. With us today are three members of the political science faculty at Ball State University. They are Gary Crawley, Ray Sheely, and John Rouse. John, this is a political primary. It's called a political primary. Not that many people vote in this political primary. Then why should we be concerned about this year particularly?
Well, Larry, our system, of course, is a democracy. The problem is if you don't have an educated public participating in a democratic process, it's really probably not that much better than a dictatorship. So it's extremely important for the public to be concerned in terms of knowing who the candidates are and what they stand for. We have essentially, as everyone knows, a two-party system. The Democrats and the Republicans share power in our system. So it's important, again, in terms of an educated public, that they participate. Otherwise, it makes our system not that much better than any other system.
They must participate whether they want to or not. The vote totals, the percentage of registered voters who actually turn out to political primaries is not very large. And these are essentially political primaries, are they not? Which Republicans pick Republicans, Democrats pick Democrats. So should we drag people to the polls kicking and screaming and say, participate, folks? Is that the purpose, Gary Crawley?
Well, first of all, I should probably make it clear that I'm opposed to primaries, precisely for the kinds of reasons that John was talking about. It's not so much a question of, first of all the people being uninformed. I think it's a question of most of the people that vote in the primaries being uninformed. Traditionally, that is, historically, we used a convention system of nominating. And the presumption there, the underlying rationale, is that of course, the party is selecting its own nominees. That is, these are the nominees for office, the candidates that will go on the ballot in the November election, are actually party people. That is, they're representatives of a Democratic or Republican party. In the convention system, you nominated or you selected delegates that would attend the convention, and then they would do the nominating. Now, we still have some conventions. For example, here in Indiana, we'll have a Secretary of State's race, and those candidates will be nominated in state convention. But the underlying rationale behind a convention is that the delegates are people that are loyal to the party. They probably have been active in party affairs for a number of years. They look at both candidates in terms of how those they look at any candidates in terms of how those candidates kind of match up with party philosophy and party position on issues, etc. And then they make the selection in terms of which candidate is best representative of the party in a particular election, as well as which candidate's most likely to win, of course. When we began moving to a primary system, what you in effect do is open the nomination process up to the general public at large. And you get an influx of people voting or taking part in the nomination process that aren't that concerned about the party, probably don't know that much about the candidates or their positions on issues or how well they match up with the party's positions on issues. And as a matter of fact, you allow outsiders, you provide an opportunity for outsiders to come in and win the party's nomination. And as a matter of fact, we've seen quite a bit of evidence of that, of course, with the LaRouche candidates this time, but historically, ever since we've had primaries, there have been what we might call outsiders coming in, winning the party's nomination, and then officially they go on the ballot as the Democratic or Republican nominee. The problem with that is it becomes much more difficult to hold government accountable, because while people have a pretty good idea of where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party stand, they don't have much of an idea of where individual candidates or elected officials stand, for example, in Congress or the state legislature. So when you let an outsider win the nomination and then win office as a Democrat, and he begins taking positions on bills in Congress that are contrary to the Democratic position, there's no way for the voter, or it's very difficult for voters to hold these officials accountable in some future election and say, you know, we don't agree with that, and we're going to defeat you. That the system begins to break down at that point. I think that's what John was referring to in terms of if you have uninformed voters in a primary system, they're almost voting blind in many cases. And it's very difficult to say or to hold government accountable for the policies that they've enacted.
Gary, now, did I hear you say that you were against the primary system?
Oh, certainly.
Well, how would you get people to participate in the system if you don't allow a open system where people can join political parties at will and run as candidates? Isn't your statement basically anti-democratic?
Oh, no.
Aren't you being
not having a
anti-democratic
primary has nothing to do with keeping people from being involved in politics. As a matter of fact, I would argue if you had a convention system with delegates attending a convention and the party people, say in caucus in counties, selecting the delegates, there would be more of an incentive for people to participate, in particular in the political parties, rather than less. If voting is the only form of participation that you're after, then by eliminating the primary, obviously you eliminate one opportunity to vote, although people obviously are still going to vote in the general election. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to be involved in other forms of participation. As a matter of fact, it becomes, I think the opportunities would increase.
So the thing you're trying to advocate in a way is more responsible voting.
That's right.
In the system.
That would seem to cut the cost of campaigning as well, would it not? I mean, you're not appealing to the general public, but to basically party people.
Sure. As a matter of fact, when you run a campaign, if it's a convention system of nomination, you don't even bother with television commercials and so forth statewide. What you do is you travel, for example, the state of Indiana, and you talk to precinct committeemen and county chairmen and other members of the party that are either likely to be delegates to a convention or will indeed be the delegates to the convention, and those are the people you're trying to sell. And of course, you sit down and try, if you sit down and try to sell yourself as a candidate to a group of party individuals, that is precinct committeemen, let's say, obviously they're going to be asking you, well, what have you done as a Republican or a Democrat? What are your positions on these issues that the party's taken a stand on, and so on and so forth. They're going to pick the candidate that matches up, as opposed to the candidate that comes in from outside, spends $2 million, and wins a nomination.
10 or 12 years ago, Indiana took the Senate and the governor and lieutenant governor out of the convention, put them in the political primary. The lieutenant governor has since been put back into the convention. Does Indiana really know where it's headed in terms of political primaries, Ray Sheely?
Well, let me answer that question as well as pick up on something that Gary said. I don't think the political party system should be afraid of the people. And indeed, if the political party system is going downhill and is shattered and factionalized and fractionalized and every other word, as a matter of fact, the responsibility of the leaders of the political party is to rebuild it along the lines that have popular appeal for the voters. Now, I think the voters in a primary do indeed focus on certain high visible races. For example, U.S. Senate races, gubernatorial races, those top ballot, if you will, offices. They do know, and we know this from our studies, they do know more about those candidates. However, when you start getting down into the ballot and you start talking about Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor, okay, the example of the LaRouche candidate over in Illinois, he won the Democratic nomination for Lieutenant Governor. Well, nobody knew what was happening there at the Lieutenant Governor's race, but everyone knew the candidates for the governor on both the Republican and the Democratic tickets. So I think Indiana, to answer your question directly, Indiana's got a pretty good formula working. We nominate in direct primary the very highly visible offices, that is U.S. Senate and Governor. The rest we leave to attentive partisans, that is delegates that go to state conventions. And we make certain then that the people that get nominated for the lower offices on the ballot, the less visible offices, do indeed have some party credentials, that they are compatible with the platforms and the beliefs of the party. I think the Indiana formula is pretty good on this. We've toyed with it, as you indicated, Larry, but really we've toyed with it only in the sense of the lieutenant governor. And I think one of the primary reasons we moved back to the convention nomination for the lieutenant governor was cost. It just is awfully expensive to wage a statewide primary nomination campaign. And you can cut costs dramatically by just appealing to the delegates, as Gary was indicating.
Yeah, Ray and Gary, since you guys are the experts in the political science department on political parties, and as we look at the LaRouche phenomena, especially in Illinois, is this LaRouche thing a healthy thing for American political parties as far as the impact, or is it not so healthy?
In terms of the LaRouche candidate himself, or themselves, it's probably not all that healthy because they're not only outsiders, but they're rather extreme in their views. For example, their emphasis that candidates and office holders from the parties, the royal family in Great Britain, and so on and so forth, are involved in drug trafficking.
But
their contention,
what's wrong with that, Gary?
Well, I think that's taking politics to the extreme. There's no discussion of issues there, for example.
Well, drugs are an issue, are they not?
Oh, well, yes, but when you say that Kissinger and Mondale are in effect Soviet spies, I mean, I think you're just going for sensationalism, and it's not healthy in the sense that you're discussing problems in society or issues. I think it's healthy to some extent in the sense that Ray was talking about, in that it's clear now that the party is wide awake across the nation and looking out for LaRouche candidates. In other words, it'll be very difficult for a LaRouche candidate to sneak in, as some would contend they did in Illinois, and in effect steal the nomination, and not literally steal the nomination, but win the nomination by being unknown.
Then you're dismissing their claims that LaRouche candidates won in Illinois because that's the direction the American voter is moving.
Oh, I don't think there's any question of that. I don't think it was a question of issues at all. And as a matter of fact, which goes back to my point, that I would argue the people in Illinois really had very little idea as to who these candidates were and what their stands were and how they were matching up with major issues of the day and so on and so forth.
Let me, if I could, interject something here. Who has a responsibility in our political system for informing the electorate? It seems to me our conversation up to this point has been focused primarily on the political party leadership that perhaps was asleep at the switch over in Illinois and did not get the word out on who was the genuine Democrat versus the LaRouche candidates. But I think there's a larger responsibility that perhaps we ought to look at as well from another sector, and that's the media. I don't know whether or not, and we try to keep up a bit with the Chicago and the Illinois newspapers, for example, and I'm not convinced that the media wasn't asleep at the switch as well. The lead editorials, for example, in a couple of the Chicago newspapers after the primary, tried to blame the party leaders. But as I monitored the letters to the editor, they were certainly coming back to the newspaper and saying, wait a second, I read the Sunday before the election, and you guys didn't point out in your list of candidates that this was a LaRouche-backed candidate. I think there was a failure from a couple of perspectives. There's enough blame over there to go around. I'm not so certain that we ought to always just focus on the average voter on the street and say, well, you're uninformed. I mean, we have to, as educators in our instance, as media people, and as perhaps the political party leaders, all of us have a responsibility to make certain that this kind of information gets out. I don't think that happened in Illinois.
If I could try to answer my own question in terms of how healthy it is, I think it's kind of fun. Now, if I were Adlai Stevenson, I would.
He doesn't.
I mean, he doesn't think it. But, you know, I think it's important for us to focus upon who these LaRouches, or however you pronounce the name, or the group is, or in terms of their issues. For example, they are in opposition to the Graham-Rudman law. A lot of people are in opposition to the Graham-Rudman law.
Including
because,
President Reagan.
Right. Because it takes the responsibility from the politicians and gives it to a bunch of bureaucrats. The second thing that they are in support of is SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars. I mean, that's an issue, Gary, in terms of society. They are also in opposition to the decoupling with Europe. In other words, they don't want to break up NATO. A fourth issue that you mentioned, which they have made some very wild accusations on, is that they are very much in support for a war on drugs. And they really want to get at this war. And
public trials, public hangings. Yeah, I'd say they're pretty serious about it.
And
they also want to screen all Americans for AIDS.
Right, and that's the fifth issue. They want to make sure that there is drastic action against AIDS.
And I'm not going to take the test.
Well, that's your business.
Well, it is now, but I'm not sure it would be if LaRouche candidates won. Part of my point is, it just seems to me it comes through very clear that the LaRouche position is get us in office, we'll decide what's right, and then we will impose that on the American people regardless of rights, liberties, etc. That is First Amendment freedoms, due process, right on down the list.
Yeah.
And now, obviously, they're not coming out arguing that, but that's my impression. And
Are they neo-Nazis?
Well, without a doubt.
In my
neo-Nazis?
In my assessment, yes.
And they are classified, of course, as neo-Nazis, but even this word neo-Nazi is probably a vague kind of concept in the American public mind. It really has ancestry back to Italy in the 1920s and Germany, of course, in the 1920s and so forth. A one-party dictatorship, suppression of opposition groups, private ownership is owned by a centralized governmental functionary in a sense, and it also has a strong focus upon nationalism and racism. So the place where they seem to get themselves in trouble is on this issue of the neo-Nazi. I mean, Janice Hart and Mark Fairchild seem to be emerging politicians, if they are emerging, who have very distinctive, clear views about everything in life, and most politicians are pragmatists.
So what's 1986 going to be known for these political primaries as a political season, besides giving LaRouche people a lot of ink, a lot of exposure? What's going to come out of this primary season, or even this election this year?
Actually, I think in Indiana, in particular, it's a rather quiet primary. As a matter of fact, there are no major political battles in the sense that we've seen in the past. Probably the hottest race is the Bowen-By race for Secretary of State, but that's going to be decided in convention, not in the primary. As you go through the various races in Indiana, there does not seem to be that much controversy in terms of candidates fighting within the
no
party.
real race for Senate, and and only one legitimate contest, I guess, in the 10 congressional districts. That's the Republican side in the 5th district.
That's right.
Incumbents
due to an incumbent leaving.
Sure, but incumbents otherwise will just pretty much are expected to walk away with the election. You might look at the 8th district come fall, but as far as the primary is concerned,
it's really ho-hum.
Exactly.
I would say that probably next week we're going to have a low turnout. There's not a whole lot of excitement. There's no hard-hitting campaigns, hotly contested in virtually any district. Now, down at the county level, of course, there's always, most of the sheriffs are up this year across Indiana. Many of the county offices are up. So there will be hotly contested local races, but those are not the kind of races that really will generate an upswing in turnout. We're going to see a low turnout election next week.
Well, I think one thing we have to say, we have two basic kinds of values in American life, and people seem to vote in the marketplace as often as they vote in the ballot box. And if the political parties offer similar kinds of platforms, that they're between elections, there may be as much activity in the shopping center as in the ballot box. But to get to some of the philosophical responses here, don't you agree that the political parties may indeed be more responsible in trying to get their act together vis-a-vis some of these fringe groups?
Yes, in that sense, the LaRouche candidates or conspiracy, if you want to take a look at it that way, is healthy. It's obviously awakened the party leaders that may have been asleep at the switch, and that's going to be good for the party system. I think there's LaRouche candidates, in over half the states filed at different levels of office.
Yeah.
So the party and in both the Democrat and the Republican parties, although they're concentrated on the Democrat side. But the Republicans have a cause as well, a reason to be alerted. Consequently, I think it's healthy in the sense of regenerating some partisan attention to these outsiders.
But on the other hand, you're still going to have people that aren't all that concerned about the Democratic and Republican Party voting to nominate Republican and Democratic candidates. Now, if LaRouche wants to go on, if he wants his candidates to go on the November election ballot, let him form a third party, let him file petitions or whatever is required and get on the ballot that way and say, here are the LaRouche party candidates. Here are the Republicans, Democrats, and LaRouche. Now, vote accordingly.
Well, let me take you a little step. Isn't the problem really for the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party doesn't have its act together, and it seems to me that nationwide and also in the states, the Republicans, because of their more narrow focus in terms of their constituents, they better have their political thing together than do the Democrats.
Oh, I think that's probably true if you look at the national party. I'm not so certain it's true if, as you move through the states, clearly in some states, the state Democratic Party is disorganized. I would argue that's the case in Indiana, for example.
That's not the case in New York.
But yeah, in other states, that's not necessarily. In other words, I'm not sure you can make that general statement that the Democratic Party is disorganized and everything else. I think you have to understand both parties are very decentralized. And we have the national party, the state party, the county party, and as you move through those different organizations and move from state to state and county to county, in both parties you run into very organized, well-run organizations for both parties, and then loosely organized organizations just depending on where you are. So I don't know if I'd make that general statement. Certainly in the national level, in terms of getting a presidential campaign, the Democrats have demonstrated a certain amount of disorganization in recent elections.
Is this a Republican year because things domestically are in good shape, the economy is in good shape, the inflation is down, or is this a Democratic year because the sitting president, a Republican, is in the middle of his term? Which way do we argue?
Well, let me take a stab at that. It depends to some extent what level of office you're talking about. Let's talk about Congress for a moment. It's going to be a Democrat year in the Congress. This is a midterm election, what we call. The president is in midterm. Turnout will obviously plummet from what it was 2 years ago in 1984 because the presidency is not at stake. And the normal loss of seats of the president's party in midterm elections is going to occur this year. That is, the party out of power in the White House always gains seats in the midterm. I think we've had one exception to that in the last 50 or 60 years. So consequently, the historical patterns are clear. The Democrats will probably pick up seats in the Congress. I'm talking about the U.S. House of Representatives. The Senate, the slight edge could be given to the Democrats, but again, mainly numerically, because there's more Republican seats up this year in the U.S. Senate than Democrat seats. But those are highly visible statewide races, and that can turn on the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of a campaign. The Democrats do have a shot at regaining control of the U.S. Senate. At the state-to-state level, as Gary was kind of pointing out, you really have to analyze the strength of the parties in these various states for the governorships that are up, for the various local offices that are up. But certainly the Republicans will win in Republican areas. Democrats will be advantaged, I think, nationally in the sense of the election of the Congress.
Do you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree in general. I would point out, though, you were talking about this may be a Republican year, '86, because of the economy and so on and so forth. Now, part of that presumption is tied in with Reagan being a popular president, which he is. On the other hand, it's also clear from polls that people don't necessarily match up with President Reagan on issues. Rather, his popularity seems to be stemming from his personality and his image as president.
It's a personal factor.
That's right. It's kind of what we might call the father figure, and usually we point back to Eisenhower had a considerable amount of support from that factor. So I'm not so sure that people are all that satisfied with the economy, and I think the economy can turn very quickly. For example, if gasoline prices start going back up, if food prices go up, and it won't take much, and if inflation starts to go up a bit, that could be a factor. I think people are still, maybe we've settled in with interest rates, but I think interest rates are still relatively high, and people are a bit concerned about that. I think unemployment's still relatively high, although we've come to accept a higher level as the norm now than we used to. I'm not so certain that people are all that satisfied in terms of
the policies.
Of the policies coming out of the Reagan administration. And so I think it's pretty much a toss-up. I look for Democrats to gain for primarily the same reasons that Ray was pointing out.
My own opinion is one that I think Ray touched on, and that's the issue. There are going to be individual races. And just as Reagan has been an individual candidate, I think I hate to go against your specialization, guys, but this is going to be, the political parties may have less influence. And in the end, it's going to be the economy, as you say, and also the candidates who have the most money in their campaign chest.
That's the Republicans. Okay.
Typically.
All right. That's the way it works. All right. We're out of time today. Thanks to our panelists, Ray Sheely, Gary Crawley, and John Rouse for the commentary here. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.